So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Paris. I'm the director of the Guelph Institute of Development Studies and an associate professor in the Department of Political Science. Welcome. It's great to be here, and it's great to be in a room that is buzzing. I've heard the word buzzing, and it's just wonderful. I believe we also have, the last count was how many people online? 114 people online, and probably the number is going up as we speak. So welcome to those of you who are joining us online. And let me extend an official welcome to our very special guest, Dr. Leanne Bita-Samose Simpson. Thank you so much for joining us here today. There has been so much excitement on campus about this visit, and there is no better time than today to have this lecture when it does feel like there's a lot of stuff happening in the world right now. And we're here together to think through how we can collectively respond to this world that we're in. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you here today for the annual Hopper Lecture. This lecture represents 3 decades of collaboration with the International Development Research Center and is one of the most important events in our calendar. Today's lecture is especially significant as we're marking the 30th anniversary of the Hopper Lecture. The University of Guelph is located on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, which is a land that is within the jurisdiction of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty and Treaty 3. It is a great honor that we are joined today by Chief Stacey Laforme, who is the elected chief of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. Chief Laforme was first elected to council in 1999 and was elected as chief in 2015. He's also served on numerous boards and committees, including his role as the chair of the Pan Am Games Secretariat Committee, which, when the Mississaugas of the Credit were recognized as the first ever official host First Nation of the Games. He's also a storyteller and poet, and I would urge you all to read his book of poetry, Living in the Tallgrass, Poems of Reconciliation. Thank you for joining us here today, Steve Laforme, and please come to the podium to say a few words of welcome.
I came in and there was nobody in the room. I looked behind me and it's full. It's good. You're very supportive and obviously quiet, so that's good. So Ani, Bazu, Nagani, Anishtabekanini, Stacey Laforme, Disnakas, Credit Dunjaba, Mainga Dodam, Mississauga, Anishinaabe Dao. Just told you where I'm from, what my clan is, what my Anishinaabe name is, how much I paid for this shirt. Oh, you've been teaching in this job. So first off, I came up here with this big binder, right? But just got my lunch in it. I know I was going to be here where there's lots of teachers and students, and I wanted to look like I was prepared. This shirt I'm wearing is a ribbon shirt that was gifted to me for a speaking event, and I'm very proud of it. But I have many other ribbon shirts that I wear at various different times, and some are pretty fancy and colorful. I remember I had a satin or silk powdered blue ribbon shirt that said Mississauga Nation on the back, and I was wearing it in the store one day, and a man came up to me, he goes, "That's a nice shirt." I said, "Thank you." He went on to say, "It takes a special kind of man to wear a shirt like that." So I chuckled and said thanks, but it made me think that when I was younger, I would have been too afraid to dress like this and too afraid of what others would say. But the truth is, we should never have to change to fit into society. The world around us should adapt to embrace our uniqueness. That's how we become better today than we were yesterday, is that inclusivity. So I'm sorry I'm taking up all your time. My sister, from Mississauga. Lots of poets in the Mississaugas, I think. So A while ago, I met a woman for like a minute, and her name was Josephine, and she was a water walker. And she walked, they estimated half the circumference of the earth, trying to bring attention to water and awareness to water. And I didn't know her really, and I heard she was sick. So I sat down and I wrote this to her, actually from my take on her perspective, which is pretty arrogant when you think of it. So I sat there and I finished it, and I'm like, I've got to email this to her. Well, I can't do that. That's just too arrogant of me. No, I can't. So I sat there arguing myself for a few minutes, and then I finally said, no, I wrote it for her, so I'm going to send it to her. And so I did. I got up the nerve and emailed her, and she responded right away, and she said she cried buckets, and that it meant a lot. And her family said that she told them it just says everything about her journey. And they gave it out at her services, and I think that had I not had the courage to give it to her that time, it would have been a missed opportunity for her and for I. So I'm glad, and it's okay. I'll share it with. Well, doesn't matter if you're okay. I got the mic. Oh, and it's simply called "Walks Forever Woman." I've been called a hero. I have been called crazy. It does not matter what people say, but do not doubt. I have been called. I saw the anguish upon the water, the pain, the hurt. I sat in ceremony with tears streaming. I knew I must do something, and so I asked. Walk, grandmother, sing, dance, ceremony, but walk. So walk I did for the water, sometimes with others, sometimes alone. I thought that once my first walk was done, I would rest. Again I was called. Walk, grandmother. So I walked, and always upon the end of the walk, I thought, now I rest. But the call is not gone, so I walk. This may be the final time my feet travel the earth around the water. Upon my deathbed, they will say, you have done enough. Rest. I will smile and nod for them. Yet I know I will continue on this journey, for I still feel the call. I still hear the voice. Walk, grandmother. I sometimes wonder why no one hears the voice of the water. Maybe no one who's alive today remembers. So I will walk, and you may hear my voice, my drum. You may walk by my side, or you may glimpse my passing. This is not a curse. This is a cause, an honor. I will walk for the spirit of the water. I will walk until duty is not forgotten. I will walk until you walk. For I have learned that the voice says walk, but it means lead. So I will walk until you hear and you answer. So stand, grandmothers, grandfathers, parents, children, stand. For you must stand, and you must stand together. Then you must walk, and I will walk beside you. For even as I pass, I hear the words, walk, grandmother, walk. So, thank you. You don't have to applaud, but we'll be here a long time if you don't. Oh, listen, I just wanted to say thanks for having me here, and I know it'll be a wonderful conversation because somebody who more understands water than I will be speaking. I do want to say, though, that what's become part of my sort of tagline and everything I do now, because it's so important to me, is that I tell people always, instead of thinking of climate change as a problem to be solved, think of Mother Earth as a soul to be saved. If we can do that, we can change everything. Miigwech, Mamapi.
Thank you very much, Chief LaForme. I have a few words of housekeeping before I invite Sandra Gagnon to provide some opening remarks and before our Provost Gwen Chapman makes her formal introduction of our speaker. First, this event would not have been possible without the contributions of many people, and there are too many people to mention by name here. But please know that we are grateful to the volunteers who helped you find this space. It's not always an easy room to find. This lecture would not have happened without the endowment provided by our wonderful friends at IDRC. So thank you for your continued support and friendship. Second, I want to thank Morgan Bennett. Morgan's over there. Give us a wave, Morgan. Who has very recently jumped in to provide temporary admin assistance in GIDS, and she had to dive right in the deep end right when we were ramping up for this lecture. So thank you, Morgan, for all of your hard and careful work behind the scenes. She's taken care of all the details of this visit, and we would be lost without you. I also want to thank Kara Waycamp. Where are you, Kara? Hi, Kara. The Assistant Vice President of Indigenous Initiatives, for all the support and guidance you've provided to me personally in preparation for the visit. Thank you, Natasha Young, and I don't know if Natasha's here because she had to leave campus early today, but Natasha, if you're watching, she's the manager of the Indigenous Student Center. Thank you so much for your collaboration in arranging the student meetings. Finally, thank you, Lisa Blenkinsop. Give us a wave, Lisa, for your support, and to Erin Nelson. Give us a wave, Erin, for coming back from sabbatical to help us moderate the online chat. Another final housekeeping note about the format of the lecture today. Please hold your questions until after the lecture is finished. There will be time at the end of the lecture for you to ask a question. For folks who are attending remotely on Teams, please type your question in the chat, and I will ask Erin Nelson to read it on your behalf. I would now like to invite Sandra Gagnon to say a few words. Sandra is a senior program specialist at IDRC, where she has worked since 2016. Thank you so much for making the trip up from Ottawa to be here today. Please come up.
I'm much smaller. I won't be as funny as Chief. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you to the Guelph Institute for Development Studies for inviting me today. Good afternoon, everyone. Bon après-midi à toutes et à tous. C'est un honneur pour moi d'être ici au nom du CRDI à l'occasion de la conférence Hopper. It's an honor for me to be here on behalf of IDRC for the annual Hopper lecture being delivered by Dr. Lian Batassa Mosake Simpson in presence of Chief Stacy Laforme and on the land of the Mississauga of the Credit. Belonging to IDRC, the Hopper lecture is very significant, and mostly this year, which is the 30th anniversary. Let me first tell you a little bit more about IDRC for maybe those of you that may not know very well the organization. So the International Development Research Center, IDRC, is a Canadian Crown corporation. We are part of Canada's Foreign Affairs and Development family. We support practical research in the Global South, which is led in partnership and with researchers in the Global South, and which aims to improve lives and livelihoods and support more sustainable and inclusive society. The Hopper Lectures was created 30 years ago, as we said, by the University of Guelph with support from IDRC to honor the legacy of IDRC's first president, David Hopper. In office from 1970 to 1978, he really laid the basis of what became IDRC that we know today. Already at that time, the relationship with our partners was one of respect and trust, where countries would set their own research priorities, they would conduct their own studies, and apply the solutions their own people would think are appropriate. Today, in the area of decolonization, we continue with this vision where our direct partners are not only from the Global South, but they are also those that are directly affected by global or local challenges. We believe in the importance to value their ideas, their perspective, their vision of how we understand and relate to the world, and to establish other type of relationship with each others and with nature. It is also an honor for me to be here today because I'm very close to the indigenous world. My husband is an indigenous leader of the Coya people in North Argentina. And yes, there are some indigenous people in Argentina, in spite of the common understanding that it's a country composed of white people. The work of colonization and invisibilization of indigenous people have been strong, unfortunately, but their culture, cosmovision, and way of life, and that of many other people and nations in the region, remain vibrant, strong. At IDRC, I work in a program dedicated to climate resilient food system, a team where the knowledge and vision of indigenous people take all its sense. When we see what the current agribusiness is doing to nature and to us. We think it's important to go back to the teaching of knowledge keepers, to the practice that are already out there, with the understanding that solutions that are not always with more technology, more innovation, it can't be. In line with this vision, we developed an initiative where the very people that are the most affected by today's challenges take the lead, not as beneficiaries, how they are often called. So they develop their own project as a leader. So these projects are developed by indigenous organizations. For instance, in Latin America, for instance, we have one of the projects that is led by a university in Ecuador called Indigenous and Intercultural University of Amautahuasi. This is just an example. Another one is a project who's led by a team composed of researchers from the very communities where the project takes place. As part of this vision of the approaches to decolonizing knowledge, we also link our work to the Canadian colonial experience and the current struggles of communities in the North when it comes to climate change and food security. 2 weeks ago, we organized events in the context of Adaptation Future in Montreal to engage on these important conversations. Many of our partners from the South, but also from the North, could exchange on common challenges, but also on strategies to address climate justice, free prior informed consent, inclusive decision-making, for instance, land rights, and they could exchange together on their experience. As we consider addressing the threat of climate change and other shocks at our level, like the pandemic or others, mobilizing ideas, solutions, and will in an equitable, just, and inclusive way has to be part of our everyday work. We are very fortunate today that Dr. Betasa Mosake Simpson is delivering this year's Hopper Lecture. It will be a great pleasure for me to listen to her and to learn from her. Au nom du CRDI, je remercie l'Université de Guelph, Madame Betasa Mosake Simpson, et vous tous ici de continuer d'appuyer la conférence Hopper. On behalf of IDRC, thank you very much to the University of Guelph, to Madame Betasa Mosake Simpson, and to all of you for supporting the Hopper Lectures. Thank you. Merci.
I'd now like to invite our Provost Gwen Chapman to offer our formal introduction of our speaker. Gwen became Provost and Vice President Academic of the University of Guelph in 2020. Prior to that, she was the Dean of the College of Social and Applied Human Sciences and was in that position when the Guelph Institute of Development Studies was created in 2018. So it's wonderful to have you here, Gwen, and thank you so much for offering this introduction.
Thank you, Andrea, and it's great to see so many people here today. Great to see a good turnout. Good afternoon, everybody, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Leanne Bedasmuse-Simpson. Dr. Simpson, an acclaimed Michi Sagi Nishnabak scholar, writer, musician, and activist from Alderville First Nation, holds a Bachelor of Science degree in biology from the University of Guelph. So her most important degree, but she actually also has a Master of Science in Biology from Mount Allison University, a PhD in Interdisciplinary Studies from the University of Manitoba. She teaches at the Dashinta Center for Research and Learning, an Indigenous land-based educational institute in Denendeh, Northwest Territories, and at other post-secondary institutions across Canada. Her extensive and influential work, which includes 8 books published since 2016, and that's pretty impressive, defies easy categorization. It encompasses essays, stories, poetry, correspondences, and a novel. She's received numerous awards and recognition. For example, her 2022 book, Rehearsals for Living, co-authored with Robin Maynard, became a national bestseller and was shortlisted for the Governor General's Literary Award. Written during the height of the COVID-19 lockdowns, the book consists of intimate letters between the two authors, exploring possibilities for feminist and anti-racist solidarities and futures. Her 2017 book, As We Have Always Done, Indigenous Freedom Through Radical Resistance, received the Best Subsequent Book Award from the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. It advocates for a radical resurgent project deeply rooted in Indigenous knowledge, emphasizing Indigenous resistance and the creation of new futures based on land-based Anishinaabeg theory and practice. Her acclaimed book, Nopiming, The Cure for White Ladies, which redefines storytelling through fragments and poetry, introduces readers to Anishinaabe aesthetics and storytelling, and was shortlisted for the Governor General's Literary Award. And her collection of stories and poetry, This Accident of Being Lost, was a finalist for Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize and the Trillium Book Award. In addition to the writing, she's produced 3 albums, including her 2021 album, Theory of Ice, which was shortlisted for the Polaris Prize. Dr. Simpson's activism, expressed through her scholarly and artistic work, her community leadership and teaching, focuses on resisting settler colonialism, white supremacy, extractivism, and heteropatriarchy. She firstly criticizes the politics of reconciliation and recognition in Canada and calls for collective acts of resistance and decolonization. And she challenges individuals and institutions to take responsibility for dismantling colonial and patriarchal structures that continue to structure our lives. So today, we are so honored to have Dr. Simpson come to the University of Guelph to deliver the 30th anniversary Hopper Lecture titled Theories of Water. Welcome.
Bonjour, Ani Kinawaya, Kiriga Virginia Danawema, Kinagachi Nishnabek Ogami Donjaba, Nagojawani Megwadoda, Bidas Musa, K Nadijnikas, Nigachinandam Givajayan, Gibbon Watching Cook, Chimi Gwech, Gima La Form for starting us out, laughing, and also for invoking Josephine Mandamin Ba and her tireless work for water. That was a really wonderful way to begin in the lecture. I want to thank Andrea for inviting me and chauffeuring me around all day. And also to Morgan and Ross for their technical support. That really makes my job a lot easier. I also want to shout out all the Indigenous students that I've been visiting with today. That's been really, really amazing. When I was a student here at Guelph 100 years ago, it was very lonely for Indigenous students. And so it's been wonderful to come back and to see all of the fantastic changes and the beautiful community that you have here now. I also want to shout out Maurice Switzer, who is from Alderville First Nation, who is a writer, a teacher, a helper, a Shkabewis, and who has done so much work for Anishinaabe people in Elderville and also in our nation. And so it's just an honor to have you here in the audience as well. This past year, I've been traveling with Robin Maynard and our book, Rehearsals for Living, which is a series of letters that we wrote to each other during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic and during the Black uprising of the summer of 2021. Unfortunately, the letters are not two moms exchanging recipes and tips. They were meant to be a thinking alongside of each other and bringing into conversation abolition and Anishinaabe practices of world making. That practice of traveling and visiting with people and sharing ideas brought me into many discussions with Black feminists, abolitionists, Indigenous peoples, and many other anti-colonial movements and struggles, dreaming and organizing their way out of racial capitalism, colonialism, and heteropatriarchy. The book was written when it felt like the world was falling apart. And this feeling only intensified as we traveled. This has only intensified for me this week after watching the catastrophic situation unfold in Gaza. It's been 3 years of pandemic, freedom convoys, extinct glaciers, abortion and book bans, police killings, children alone in cages at borders, the resurgence of fascist states, open-air prisons for entire peoples, and a dying planet showing us its pain through floods, wildfires, and unprecedented everything. What inoculated me from total despair was meeting so many amazing organizers who are fighting back in inventive ways and who are engaged in struggle as a world-making process. In my earlier work, Dancing on Our Turtle's Back, and as we have always done, I argued for a turn away from the state and into Indigenous thought and embodied practice as a way of taking back Indigenous liberation from the state and the politics of recognition, the Aboriginal rights discourse, the state's land claim and self-government process, reconciliation, all of that, and to begin to make Indigenous worlds that refused the structures that reproduce colonialism. I think the idea was to sink into land-based practices, into language, into Indigenous thought, and to come together on the land, engaged in Indigenous practices, to generate the knowledge we needed to dream, vision, and build otherwise. My work was land-based. It was Mississauga or Michi-Saagiig Anishinaabeg. And when I look back now, I see myself beginning to try and articulate Anishinaabe formations beyond the nation state. I see myself falling into complex practices or concepts within Anishinaabewin that transformed my thinking and that made the kind of hierarchy and violence required in colonial systems unthinkable. So for 2 decades, I'm off in the bush doing Anishinaabe things. And then finally, I start to get it. I start to think a lot about world making because it was and is a constant and continual part of Anishinaabe life. It was a daily practice for individuals and families, and then it was scaled up into larger formations. It was always collaborative and temporary. It changed with the seasons and circumstances as relationships transformed. Getting up every morning and organizing life with whatever you had and whomever was present was the fabric of Anishinaabe life and of generating new forms of communal knowledge. Every day, every moment was an opportunity to embody kindness, consent, self-determination, and generative collaboration. My ancestors saw their purpose in life was to live within the natural world And they wanted to do that in a way that generated more life, or Minobamadzwin. They designed ethical practices to promote the diversity of life on the planet. They wanted to build interconnected and interdependent Anishinaabe worlds as ecologies of care and intimacy. Worlds that are living reciprocal collaborations with all forms of life, not just humans. Worlds that are networks cycling through time and space, expanding and contracting across scales. Worlds without hierarchy and prisons and police and schools and states and borders and property and enclosures. Open systems, leaky systems, decentralized, transformative, emergent. Political systems grounded in normative practices, influenced and inspired by the physical cycles that reproduce the planet. Economic systems that refuse the building blocks of capitalism. Societies based on individual and collective self-determination and extensive care for all forms of life. I started to understand that it isn't my place to make the world or to remake the world. My job is to fit into the complex network of life of which I am a part, and to do that in a way that I'm bringing forth more life, not just human life, but all life. My job is to fit into the network of life and to link up with other anti-colonial world builders doing the same. My job is to collaborate with all the forms of life I share time and space with, to build systems and worlds that feed into Minobamadzwin. I'm out in the woods one day with Doug Williams-Baugh, the Curve Lake elder I worked with for several decades and who passed away 18 months ago. So we're out in the woods and Doug starts talking about eels. And I don't know what he's talking about because there are no eels in our territory. I know from my biology days here in Guelph that there are sea lampreys in the Great Lakes, but they're not even really eels, and this is definitely not what he is talking about. Doug was talking about a time when American eels, who originate in the Sargasso Sea, migrated through the St. Lawrence River, through Lake Ontario, and into the lakes, rivers, and creeks in our territory. He is talking about an abundance of eels I can't comprehend and how they were an important source of protein and medicine for our people. I start to map out the migratory route in my head. Stony Lake, Otonabee, Rice Lake, Trent River, Lake Ontario, St. Lawrence, Atlantic Ocean, Sargasso Sea, freshwater to saltwater, Mississauga, Anishinaabeg to Mohawk, to Mi'kmaq, to Taino, to the Caribbean, to the Middle Passage, to the west coast of Africa, to the northern part of South America, to the world. Every year, the eel came into my homeland as a messenger and reminded us that our world making is deeply connected, not just to the species that we share our immediate time and space with, but with the peoples and forms of life all over the world and on the land, in the water, and in the sky. And not just remind us, but carry knowledge in their bodies about how their part of the world or their ocean was. If the eels were abundant and healthy, it told people something about the health of their environment and their travel route. It told us something about ourselves as well. If the eels were scarce or thin or sick, then maybe we needed to ease off harvesting and rely on something else. Same with the birds and all the great migrators. Immersing myself within Anishinaabe thought was how I grounded myself in the now. And because of all of the dispossession colonialism had subjected me to, I needed time to spend recovering all that. The eels reminded me, though, that my responsibilities didn't stop there. They aren't just local. They aren't insular. They reminded me to bring that into conversation with those who are engaged in different but related struggles in my neighborhood and beyond. The land has taught me that any meaningful Anishinaabe world making requires not only the radical transformation of the Anishinaabe out from under the domination of colonialism, but the radical transformation of Canada and the planetary abolition of racial capitalism, its heteropatriarchal violences, and the structures that naturalize and reproduce those hierarchies it needs to replicate itself on Earth. What I learned from writing Dancing on Our Turtle's Back, as we have always done, and Rehearsals for Living, was how important it is to visit and to think alongside and to listen to Black feminists, abolitionists, and all the other peoples engaged in struggle, thought, and organizing. It's how I can make sure my world-making visions link up with their world-making visions. I could have come to this place through reading the Combahee River Collective or by listening to the migratory birds passing over my head twice a year. I could have learned all this from water. The potential of Indigenous world making is holding potential not just for our own communities and for each other, but for the entire planet. I have no idea what this looks like. I have no idea what my little Anishinaabe part could even look like, but I do know that I want to get up every morning and relearn the world, as Robin Maynard says, and organize every moment as an opportunity to embody kindness, consent, self-determination, and generative collaboration to destroy the death machine we're currently trapped in. And so this is where my new work, Theory of Water, fits in. And it's a book that is going to be published in the spring of 2025 by Knopf Canada. I got interested in water because water is just so important in my culture, in our culture, as the chief reminded us. I got interested in water because it passes through my skin and in my cells. It's inside of me, it's outside of me. And COVID-19 made us all very attentive to the water droplets in our breath. Water changes from a solid to a gas to a liquid. The global water cycle is foundational to life on the planet. Anishinaabe people moved through the land by traveling on water. So I'm going to share 3 excerpts from this new work with you today. And the first excerpt I've paired with this photo. This is my class at the Dechinta Center for Research and Learning in the territory of the Yellowknives Dene outside of Yellowknife. We are ice fishing, we are checking the net, and there's a snowmobile. Jackson Creek is a creek down the street from where I live in Peterborough, Ontario. It flows into the man-made lake, Little Lake, and then onto the Otonabee River and eventually into Lake Ontario. There is a 5-kilometer trail alongside the creek that I run on in spring, summer, and fall. And the parts of the winter, I can't ski on it. Jackson Creek is by most accounts an unremarkable urban creek. I imagine it's much like every other urban creek in North America, and it is the body of water that I spend the most time with every day. Peterborough is built on top of Jackson Creek, a fact that became evident to most residents in 2004 after more than 150 millimeters of rain fell in less than 2 hours and the creek burst over its banks and flooded downtown. These were the poetic consequences of constraining the creek to make room for urban development, and by forcing it into smaller and smaller underground tunnels, unable to carry the storm water of 2004, instead furiously expelling it outwards without regard for home, cars, or city infrastructure. Doug used to talk about the creek and its portage as part of a Mississauga Anishinaabeg route that connected Negojawani, the place at the foot of the rapids, or Peterborough, with Shimon Lake. And every time I'm on the trail, I think of Doug and I think of that passageway. Today, the creek is beginning to freeze after the first big snowstorm of the winter brought nearly 30 centimeters to us. I was up early today on the snowmobile doing passes along the trail, compacting the heavy, wet snow so that possibly tomorrow another driver could attach the groomer. I started to help groom trails a year ago during one of the pandemic winters. I volunteered at first just to keep up my snowmobile skills for when I'm in the South, so that when I return to work in the North, I didn't have to relearn how to drive the sled every time and be the embarrassing Anishinaabe in front of the Dene. So grooming certainly helped with that, but those technical skills were eclipsed by something else. Nearly every day, the snow was slightly different along the trail at Jackson Creek. I became drawn to the process of sintering. When a snowflake falls from the sky and lands on Earth, it immediately begins, or perhaps continues to transform as it forms bonds at temperatures below zero. So this is not a melting process, but it forms bonds with its neighboring snowflakes or crystals to create the fabric of a snowpack. Sintering is a joining process, a transformative communal process that creates a fabric of former snowflakes bonded to each other. It is a process of changing from a singular, angular snowflake to a more rounded form in formation of bonded crystals or snowpack, a denser, more compact, linked formation. As the snow sinters, it settles and becomes denser, stronger, and saggier under the influence of gravity. Sintering is slow deformation. Groomers pay attention to sintering because there is nothing like skiing along a well-groomed trail of packed snow. It feels like you're flying. As a groomer, there are a lot of factors that influence the sintering process: temperature, humidity, time of day, weather, who is using the trail, and how. I think of none of those things each morning I'm on the sled. I think only of this idea that the first thing a snowflake does when it falls to the land from the sky world is to join bonds, actual physical bonds, with its neighbors. It weaves itself into the environment in a way that doesn't destroy its neighbors. Sintering is bonding, building coalitions with those that you share time and space with. Those coalitions mean that the packed sinter snow on the trail has staying power and remains long after spring has melted the snow around it. Snowflakes in their own right are fascinating to me. I understand from snow scientists that they start out as a single nucleated dust particle that attracts water droplets and in turn freezes and accelerates into crystal form. The temperature and humidity in the sky world mold it into complex shapes as it moves through the atmosphere. No two are the same, and they act en masse and in commune to form magnificent storms, upheavals, and blankets. This is the second excerpt. I do not have day and I do not have moonlight. I do not believe in time. I do believe in water. That's from Dion Brand's Nomenclature. In 1991, Rebecca Belmore made a 2-meter wide wooden megaphone in response to the so-called Oka crisis, a Mohawk uprising to defend their sacred pines and a burial ground from becoming an 18-hole golf course. Rebecca wanted people to address the land directly, much like our ancestors had, and to experience political protest as poetic action. Over the next few years, Belmore traveled with the piece, setting it up on reserves, shorelines, sacred places, and sites of resistance. Along the way, she often slept beside it in her van. In Anishinaabemowin, the piece was called Ayumi Ewach Omamamoen, which means speaking to their mother. And as Belmore traveled, the piece became an instrument invoking a sort of gathering space for Indigenous people to amplify our voices and speak directly to the land. Our old people, Rebecca and mine, had and have an intimate relationship with the land and water. They spoke to the sun in the mornings and the moon at night as cherished relatives. They visited with the water lilies and Labrador tea before they picked them to make medicine. They prayed to the ones that had passed on to the spirit world, and they prayed to the spiritual beings that lived in their worlds. They spoke with and dreamed of beavers and muskrats before they harvested them. They made offerings to whitefish before setting nets, and to the lakes and rivers for safe passage. They were in constant dialogue with living things that made up their world, which is to say something, because Anishinaabe are not known as chatty people. Many Anishinaabe people still do this while harvesting, making medicines, or in ceremony. For many of us, the sound waves of our voice, vibrations made from the instrument of our bodies, are an affecting force in the universe. So it's within this context that I understand Ayumi Ewach Omamamoen. At first, Belmore installed the piece on the land, outside of the gallery, outside of the confines of the so-called white box, and in the network of living things that contain the potentiality of Indigenous peoples. In this way, the performance installation became a gathering site, a communal meaning-making project, and a space that generates knowledge. Ayumi Ewach Omamamoen replaced bodies with the relationality of land and water and asked us to relate through sound and through listening. In conversation with Anishinaabe curator Wanda Nanabush in 2014, Belmore says that her strategy of bringing a conceptual artwork in the form of a functional tool to the people and asking them to speak directly to the land, as we have always done, strengthened her understanding of the role of the artist. The artist, the maker, the visionary has always been part of who we are, she said. Looking back at the photographs and the videos from the first journeys of Ayumi Ewach Omamamoen, I get a strong sense of how the piece brought people together. At Fort William First Nation facing Lake Superior and at Wiggins Bay blockade in northern Saskatchewan, the piece is surrounded by friends, family, children, and elders. There are fires and visiting, the sharing of food and stories, and people took turns speaking through the megaphone. People were readily embracing the piece, speaking their hearts and their minds, their bodies and voices becoming the piece and the multiple meanings it generated. Searching the internet, there are only a few recordings of what Indigenous peoples said into that megaphone. And looking back now, that is a lovely part. Possibly because Ayumi Ewach Omamamoen was born in the 1990s, where we didn't record everything all the time on our phones. The thousands of conversations were private and between the speakers, those gathered at the time, and the universe. Rehearsed, unrehearsed, in English, in Anishinaabe-Moan, in song and prayer, the things that were said and the things that were unsaid were a demonic accounting of their lives, a collective accounting of a present moment. That the point of the piece was not just the content of the speeches or even the megaphone itself as a piece of conceptual art, but that the meaning was made through the practice of speaking and listening and traveling through the land, bringing people together to engage in the practice of speaking and listening to non-human forms of life, on reserves, in towns, in cities, and at sites of Indigenous land reclamation. When I think of the piece now, I think of the iconic photo of it on our sacred Nimki Waju under the care of Fort William First Nation at Thunder Bay. It was installed facing Superior, below where the Thunderbirds nest. I imagine what it would have been like that day, the laughing, the joy, the sense of being present. I remember my kids being frightened of their own voices as Ayumi Awach Omamamoan amplified them into the already scary white box gallery of the National Gallery in Ottawa, reminding us all that day of how out of place the sculpture was in the gallery. I think of birch bark moose cone collars our hunters use in the fall to call in the moose. When I look at this form, I think of the circumstances that led Belmore to be compelled to build a megaphone so that our ancestors and our relatives could hear our voices over the noise of colonialism, noise that has only become louder and more totalizing since the 1990s. While the relevance of Ayumi Awach Omamamoan still resonates today, the work gave birth to siblings in 2017 in a series called Wave Sound. Revisiting and inverting the concept of a megaphone, Belmore made 4 sculptures varying in shape and form to amplify the sound of water at the shoreline. The sculptures were installed in Banff, Alberta, at Gros Morne in Newfoundland, and in Anishinaabe territory at Puckasaw and Georgian Bay. Instead of inviting us to speak, though, Belmore was asking us to listen. Wave sound is an invitation to gather at the shore, to sit down, and to use our bodies to hear wind, rock, sand, maybe even mosquitoes, and the durational rhythm of waves. I don't look at wave sound, although I could because it is aesthetically stunning. Instead, I become enmeshed in wave sound, placing my body on the land to quiet, to listen beside Nibi, to listen through Nibi, to listen with the water, a being that changes from liquid to solid to gas, that travels the sky world, the underground, inside and outside of my body, an ancient formation of molecules that has been the same since the beginning of the world. A fugitive that arose and escapes containment, and one that we simply cannot live without. My ancestors spoke to their ancestors through the sound of rushing water. It's one of the many reasons that hydro dams, interpretive centers, and lift clocks are so irritating to us because they close off those channels of communication. The sound of rushing water is a sort of portal to another world. These waves of energy where human hearing gets altered were often places where spiritual beings lived or where certain events happened. Those sounds of water moving were also normalized. So the idea that Belmore would have to stop us, remind us, and amplify the sound so we could hear them, I think would be startling to my ancestors. I quiet, I listen. Through these rehearsals, wave sound amplifies the voices of water to cut through the noise of colonialism. It works in concert with my great-great-grandparents praying and carrying water, and with those yet to be born to become a practice. Together with my cochlea and auditory nerve, my mind and my heart, wave sound transforms from instrument to belonging as Nibi, water, Belmore, and all of the life she has gathered to work alongside me to generate meaning and inspire new worlds. And so I take Rebecca Belmore's invitation seriously. What does it mean to listen to water? What does it mean to, as Dion Brand asked us, to believe in water? In November 2021, in the midst of the fourth wave of COVID-19 in Canada, and now we've lost track, Dion Brand's A Map to the Door of No Return was miraculously enacted as a ceremony, as a gathering site, a traveling place, a celebration, and of course, as a mapping and unmapping by a brilliant formation of artists and writers thinking alongside and practicing waywardness. For me, the event co-created an autonomous zone bursting with mutual aid, stretching the boundaries of abolition and Black feminism, and celebrating the 20th anniversary of Brand's book with presence and engagements. There were readings and screenings and panel discussion, exhibitions from all over the Caribbean, South Africa, and North America. These conversations from students, emerging scholars and artists working in Black studies, geography, dance, poetry, fiction, performance, visual and performing arts marked the first retrospective of the book and its international influence, and it foregrounded, quote, a deep engagement with MAP's many readings of the world that slavery made from the 16th century to the end of the 20th century, from the context of 20 years later. Firmly locating Canada in relation to diaspora and the afterlife of slavery, MAP laid out a geography that reframes how we think about and remember slavery and freedom, that affects a change in what we presume to know and what we continue to disavow about freedom, about the quotidian effects of white supremacy, about how we inhabit, theorize, and write about Blackness, slavery, and colonialism, and their continuing effects, about revolution, longing, and Black life. And I wanted to talk about that here because, of course, Dion taught at Guelph for many, many years. I had been invited to contribute a short reflection on the book, and I was grateful to the invitation and to think alongside Brand and her map of the Door of No Return. I was grateful for the gift of that struggle. I refound the book on the endless and chaotic bookshelves in our house, and I began reading. I read and I reread the chapter entitled Pinery Road and Concession 11. I calculated temporally when Brand might have been living in my territory outside of Kinmount, Ontario, in a cabin in the woods. I thought about what I was doing in that same time period. And then, instead of writing, I drove to Pinery Road and Concession 11, and I took as my companion a black ash basket. A basket that had found its way to me through a series of family and friends, and that I was returning to the Cultural Center at Curve Lake First Nation, which incidentally was on the way to Pinery Road. So I'm in the car with the book on the dashboard, and I was thinking about place, belonging, diaspora, property, plantation, and foreclosure. When I reached the corner where Brand's car had broken down, and this is what she's writing about in that chapter, she writes about her car breaking down in this winter 20 years prior. But when I get there, I can still feel the white gaze watching me from behind curtains and fences, on lawns and between shores. I can hear the warning barks of dogs, and I can see the intersecting worlds, dirt roads, farms, quad trails, produce stands among fragments of bush. My body is filled with anxiety, rage, standoffishness, and humiliation. Taking all of this in, I got the idea of leaving a sort of surveillance camera at the corner over a 24-hour period to take time-lapsed photographs. I enlisted my partner, who is an artist and maker, to make some sort of device out of our collection of old iPhones, duct tape, and battery packs. We decided to time-lapse record the journey there and back in case the device failed. And so I ended up liking the mapping of movement and travel. The device worked well enough, although not for the full 24 hours. It caught settlers moving around, attending Thanksgiving dinners, quadding through the bush, dogs, police, and the mundane going on of whiteness. I caught a glimpse of what it feels like to be Anishinaabe near the Burnt River outside of Kinmount, Ontario. A different situation and feeling than Brand describes, but one related by history and oppression and erasure nonetheless. So this is the piece that I wrote for that gathering and to overlay over the surveillance video that I took. And it's called Pinery Road and Concession 11. The sky is dressed in 7 shades of gray, and I am dressed in 7 shades of sky. The basket is in the back seat, loosely wrapped in an opaque plastic garbage bag, waiting for its ride home. It's different than the other baskets I've seen in my life. It carries a darker color. It is also bigger with fancier detailing. I think it's made of black ash, Bapagigang, that we can barely find around here nowadays. The old ones used to harvest a tree, canoe it back to the reserve, and then pound the log until the annual rings would separate into splints. The splints were woven together into baskets. I imagine the fancier ones were sold to white folks and the mediocre ones were kept around our tents and shacks and cabins to keep our belongings. This basket is a body made out of the years of Bapagigan's life. Each of those annual rings recorded growth and weather. Each one of those an orbit that documented light, heat, water, and nourishment. I think of who might have harvested the tree and paddled it back to the community. I think who might have done the pounding to make the splints. I think of the women who wove those years into something else. I think of the woman that paddled her canoe on Chemong, going from cottage to cottage, selling and trading her hours for clothes and food for her family. We leave the city, driving through farmland speckled with Conservative and People's Party of Canada election signs. When we turn onto the reserve and cross the border, every telephone pole is wrapped in red cloth. I tell Bapagigang Makik this is because one of their young women was recently murdered by her white boyfriend, the one that loved catching frogs. We pass wooden cutouts of children dressed in pure love with the words, "Every child matters." I tell Bapagigang Makik that we're allowed to be furious and sad now, within reason. The one that ran away from school and into the bush, followed Jim cones and Madden around. The ones that didn't bring lunch to the bush, instead eating seagull and loon eggs, water snakes and frogs, porcupines and squirrels, muskrats and turtles. I wonder if Bapagigang Makik is looking out the window for their relatives. They will be hard to find. Much of the black ash was cleared by colonizers for farming and settlement, and the remaining are under threat of the emerald ash borer, an invasive beetle who came to North America inside packaging and wood crates. We stop at the old man's house beside the dump, but he isn't home. I use his outhouse and I'm overjoyed when I find the empty peanut butter jar with half a roll of toilet paper inside. Back on the road, we pass a lonely orange election sign as we pull into the cultural center. The curator meets us, and through face masks, I retell the story of the 80 or so years Bapagigang Makik traveled from an Anishinaabe woman in a canoe on the shoreline to a white lady's cottage on Chemong Lake, to a house in my birthplace, to my parents' house, and then my sister's house in Toronto, to my house in Peterborough, and then here. In a quiet voice, he says, "Welcome home." We'll show the basket to Doug. We'll show the basket to the Elders Advisory Circle. They might be able to tell who it belongs to by the signature in the style. Miigwech for bringing this home. I stop for cheap gas, a paper map, and bad coffee. There are no paper maps. It's September, the second September during the pandemic, and we've now been charged with the task of living with the virus, a code for the arithmetic that allows some of us to live without carrying the burden of those that succumb, a calculation of who we will sacrifice to line the pockets of those with money. There is heavy grief in the air. There is a turn in the light as the first cool air marks the time of year where they stole the kids, where they still take the kids and remake them into people with pockets lined with money. Summer might have held space for running and laughing and shrieking around, but there's no space for that in the fall. There's no space for the sound of children. As I leave the reserve, instead of going back to the city, I head in the opposite direction, past Misquah Zibi, which used to be called Squaw River. In 1993, some of the elders at Curve Lake First Nation, led by Gladys Taylor, launched a complaint to the Ontario Geographics Name Board to have the name of the Squaw River changed back to its original name, Misquah Zibi, meaning Red River. I think this will be the only time today I see my language. Next is Nogi's Creek. It is littered with ice cream stores and paddleboard rental shacks, cottages, and campers. None of these people will know that Chief Nogi was a chief of Curve Lake First Nation from 1830 to 1848. He was exiled from the reserve to this place by the Indian agent and the missionaries. This was no real hardship for him. Nogi's Creek was a beautiful place where he and his family could live a good life away from the surveillance of Indian agents and God. I squint to see the good life. As I turn onto Burnt River Road, I inhabit a familiar sense of dread. Oh yes, this is Michi-Sagi Anishinaabe land, and I'm grateful I'm in a car that's working well with doors that lock and a cell phone. I passed re-elect Jamie Schmal Conservative signs and elect Allison Davison PPC signs. I passed the sign for the Somerville track, land that was purchased by the County of Victoria in 1928. The land was cleared for agricultural use by the settlers, but then abandoned when it wasn't fertile enough. Red, white, and Scots pines were planted. The plantation is managed by the Ministry of Natural Resources. The trees are planted close together in rows like corn. They are the wrong species for this place. They form a forest that doesn't have any parents or language because there is only one kind of tree and they are all exactly the same age. There were only children and they grew up as best they could. I sit in its width. Anishinaabe carried travel routes in their heads, passed down and in an east-west orientation rather than a north-south orientation, focused on creeks, streams, rivers, lakes, and portages. These maps were stories upon stories of each time they had traveled the route, of each time their parents and grandparents had traveled those same rivers and lakes. There were stories of storms and hard times, of meetups and good luck, the bends and riffles, mnemonic devices for memories, the smells and sound reminders. Each journey, another ring. To travel, one had to float, paddle themselves with rivers and lakes doing the carrying. Every destination was temporary. Home, always temporary. Home, always shared. Home, always a shared practice. Homelessness, always a shared practice. Aki Mazina Igan. Aki meaning the earth, the land. Mazina Igigan, a book, a letter, a document, a paper. A book, a letter, a document, a paper. When the colonizers came, they were always lost because they refused to live within the network of the living. They needed a book, a letter, a document, a compass, a paper, a policy, a law, an accounting, so they could build fences and put up signs that say no trespassing in private property. I am getting close to why I came. Dread is filling up my stomach with sharpness. My dread, of course, is not the same register as Dion Brands when she writes, quote, "This place fills me with a sense of dread. but also a sense of mystery. Our histories and diasporas are different. What brought her to this place, and now me, decades later, are different and entwined. My dread is commingled with shame. I should feel comfortable here. I should feel connected and like I belong. I should be stronger than my fear of these landowners. I should insert myself because I don't see myself. I should know the name of Burnt River in my language. I should want to live here in a cabin and write books and do ceremony and tap maple trees. I should, and I don't. Sometimes the land defeats you, just the sum of it. I am old enough to know that coming here and retracing will not likely lead to finding whatever it is to look for, that I'm looking for. I am old enough to know that when I reach Pinery Road and Concession 11, there won't be much of anything. I am old enough to know that I won't find a home, but we all might feel a little less alone. Thank you for listening to those 3 excerpts from Theory of Water. In this moment, we are witnessing the results of 75 years of settler colonial dispossession, 56 years of occupation, and 16 years of an open-air prison of 2.2 million people in Gaza, half of which are children. It is heartbreaking and unsurprising to see settler colonial power line up behind enthusiastic genocide. I was in Palestine in May, and my heart grew with witnessing the strength of Palestinian families in the face of the quotidian violence of the Israeli apartheid regime. I am interested in making worlds where life is precious, as Ruthie Wilson Gilmore says, where Palestinian life is cherished, where Jewish life is cherished, where Indigenous and Kashmiri and Tibetan and Muslim and Black life is cherished, where over Herero life is cherished, where Uyghur life is cherished, where queer life is cherished, and where we care for the planet that sustains all of us. I am interested in building worlds where the violence of capitalism, heteropatriarchy, anti-Semitism, anti-Blackness, and colonialism are unthinkable. We need a ceasefire. We need to lift the siege and the blockade and the occupation and dismantle apartheid in Palestine and everywhere. Miigwech.
Yes, thank you so much for that lecture. It was really lovely. It was great. It's a real pleasure to listen to all those excerpts, and I'm excited for the book, so that'll be great. My name is Jonathan. I'm a PhD student here at the university in political science in particular. And I'm just quite gravitated to when you were talking about ice building bonds as it falls down and building physical bonds. And you talk a lot about relations and connections and relationalities and stuff. I was just wondering, what about non-generative relations? What about relations that aren't affirmative and aren't positive, but are actually relations of like subjugation?
Yeah, so I think that there are other Indigenous scholars who deal with that question better than I. I would say Audra Simpson and Glenn Coulthard talk about the refusal of that. And I like to use that refusal as a jumping off point. So I see my work as being part of the work that dreams and visions, that recovers some of what's lost, that is listening to the land for alternative formations and for alternative world building. So you're right. Sintering is something that, as a skier and as a groomer and as someone who loves winter, learned a lot about during the pandemic through being a volunteer at my local park for a local ski club. And I learned from that repetitive practice of getting up every day and either skiing or grooming and thinking about that snow and having that relationship to snow. And we're not in a position right now where the climate is in a very affirmative relationship with the snow, right? So I remember growing up as a kid in Wingham, Ontario, that I often had to wear my snowsuit underneath my fantastic Halloween costume. And there was often snow everywhere, and that just doesn't happen anymore. So it's not something that you can extrapolate, but it's something that I'm going to continue thinking and continue working with, because I think it's important.
Great, thank you.
Raise your hand. Is that a hand? Okay, we have a hand right here.
Hi, I'm Kareem Mosna with CFRU Radio, and I'm really curious to learn perhaps which organizations or partners that you collaborate with in this advocacy work that you're doing.
So my path has been a little bit different. I was at Trent University for a couple of years until my son was born. My son is now 21. And I left that position and I've based my practice outside of the university. I've spent a long time working with Doug Williams at Curve Lake. For the last 10 years, I've worked with the Decinta Center for Research and Learning, which is a Dene organization, and we do post-secondary accredited land-based education. So that's sort of the bulk of my work. I think that at different times, since I've learned about eels, I've been expanding sort of in a Anishinaabe internationalism, thinking alongside people like Robin Maynard, which has then connected me to organizations that are working around abolition in Toronto and beyond. And I think that solidarity work sort of keeps growing. I think during Adult No More, there was just a number of organizations that we're collaborating with. So I think, though, the spine of my practice, or the part that I really fell in love with, was sort of my language, my culture, and the land. And that's what I always go back to.
Okay, we do have one question coming in to the online chat. So we'll take the online chat question and then we'll take your question after.
Would you say water is, in a way, a connector between living beings, past ancestors, and the environment we live in?
Yes. And I think a lot of different cultures and a lot of different religions, even, there's a lot of different bodies of knowledge that would say that in different ways. And so that's, I think, why one of the reasons why water is such a teacher for Anishinaabe people.
Hi, I'm Amara Shepard. I'm in my last year of International Development Studies and my undergraduate degree here at Guelph. In your second excerpt, you talked about addressing the land directly and forming a relationship and a dialogue with the land. And I'm wondering if you might be able to expand a little bit more on kind of what that means for you and how, I guess, how you practice it.
Well, you know, the first image that I had up was a picture of a forest, and that was actually a picture from Jackson Creek. And if you think of a forest, there is a diversity of species. There's plant nations, there's animal nations, there's tree nations, there's water, there's soil, there's air, there's humans. Everything is working together in a complex ecology to reproduce itself. And so I talk about Anishinaabe homeland, but our homeland was always shared. It was always shared with all of those species. There's lots of overlap between the Anishinaabe and the Wendat, or the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. And we had these political practices and ethical practices of working together in a way that brought forth more life. So I think that I wanted to start the lecture with that idea of forest, the idea of the land, and how the land directly has a lot, I think if you're listening to it, has a lot of knowledge about how to live together, respecting each other's differences, respecting each other's self-determination, but living in a way that brings forth more life.
We have another question from online, and I'm sorry I can't attribute these questions. People are posting anonymously, but this person asks about your view on the active forgetting and abandonment of vulnerable peoples during the ongoing pandemic. And if you have any thoughts on how the theory of water provides another path than the one we are on.
Well, one of the things I think about with water is it's this, it's a global cycle. Inside my body, it's outside my body. It's our first environments, as Mohawk midwives say, where someone else is breathing for us, as Nabesi Phillips says. And so it's this global cycle that is responsible, or in part responsible, for reproducing the planet and reproducing life on the planet. And so that work is unseen and it's sort of erased. And so water is a caretaker. Water is caretaking life, whether we're acknowledging that, whether we see that or not. And so I think that that is a powerful way of being in the world. And I think my Anishinaabe ancestors knew that far better than me. And the way that they enacted that and embodied that was by taking care of the most vulnerable, and not seeing them as the most vulnerable, but seeing them as living, contributing beings to the tapestry of life. And so, yeah, I think the water has a lot to teach us about caring.
Hello, Lian. Thank you so much for your beautiful presentation. Thank you for sharing with us part of your journey. I think that for many of us, it touched our heart in terms of what you experienced and what you felt, and reminding us how we need to listen more to nature and to all living beings. My name is Jasmine. I teach sociology and international development studies here. And most of my research is about land dispossession and violence, particularly in Latin America. So the question of land is very important to me. And I was just very happy to be here to listen to you today. I have a slightly different question though, because you mentioned at the beginning, when you were talking about all these crises that our world is facing today, you mentioned freedom convoys among them. And it's interesting because also lately there has been a lot of discourse by politicians and people in positions of power about freedom. And they would say, in the free world, like this is all about, us standing up for the free world. And so with this, rise in ultra right-wing forces, we also see increasing use of the term freedom in very destructive ways, in very harmful ways. And I was hoping that maybe you can comment a little on alternative visions of what freedom is or should be or can be, other than the capitalist definition of freedom, which we see has been used to justify inflicting harm on others, basically. Thank you.
So I've been working with a PhD student, Maddie Wheatung, who is also from Curve Lake and who is a Michi-Sagi Anishinaabe geographer, who's about to defend her PhD. And she had a discussion, and she writes about it in her dissertation with Doug about freedom. And she asked him what the Anishinaabe word for freedom was or is. And he was stumped and he was frustrated and he said, freedom from what? We have responsibilities and we have deep, deep, deep relationships of reciprocity in our territory. We don't want freedom from that. And of course, he knows that we're talking about freedom from colonial violence or freedom from that container. But I thought that was really interesting. And you're right, the right is using freedom in very particular ways. I think that Black feminists use the word freedom in very particular ways. And I think that this is outside of my lane of research for sure, but I go back to that conversation that Maddie had with Doug, and I think about what my responsibilities are and how to build caring formations, families, societies where we're thinking about our responsibilities, where we're thinking about how much can I give up to promote more life.
Thank you so much.
Question online from Deborah, who first wants to thank you for your insights and your sharing. And she really appreciates you bringing in Black feminism and the situation in Gaza. And she asks, how might you bring thinking about disability in your theories of water and listening to the earth around us? And she notes that she's holding Sarah Jama in her heart as she writes this question.
Yeah, so this is one of the things that I am learning about. Disability Studies has just produced some amazing research and some amazing practices for the classroom, for activist communities, for families, for society. And this is something that I'm educating myself about, and I'm learning from those scholars and activists and people who are writing about this, because it's an area of work that that hasn't been part of sort of my research and the way that I write. But I'm first sort of my first concern actually is to bring in those practices in the classroom. So that's a work in progress for me, and it's really, really important work, and it's important that I'm accountable and responsible in learning.
Hello, thank you so much for your very powerful and insightful words today. My name is Emma. I'm currently in my last year of my undergrad studying international development at the university. And one of the things I was struck by in the last portion of your lecture was about the way in which we've mapped out the world and named it has almost given us a lack of connection, I think, sometimes to where we're at. And I'm curious to see what you think about how language and naming conventions play a part in the production and maybe the way that land is used. And also, do you feel that it's separated us in a way from land and connecting with the land?
Yeah, for sure. I was in the Indigenous Student Center today, and they have a beautiful Christy Belcourt painting in that space. And I have a Christy Belcourt painting in my house that is a map, an old Anishinaabe map of the route from Lake Superior, from Thunder Bay to Winnipeg. And the map is oriented from east to west, not north-south. And it's a water route because, of course, Anishinaabe people would have canoed. And so I think when you spend a lot of time on the land, when you spend a lot of time engaged in land-based practices, when you spend a lot of time traveling the land, you are close to the land. Your relationship becomes more intimate. When I was probably close to your age, I had an opportunity through the Assembly of First Nations, through a project called, that was looking at the effects of environmental contamination on the Great Lakes. So I was living in Thunder Bay at Fort William First Nation, and I was traveling around to those Anishinaabe communities on the North Shore of Lake Superior. And I was working in Long Lake 58 with those elders documenting their place names on maps. And what I learned is that they had hundreds and hundreds of place names on even like a single lake. All of the inlets, all of the points, places where they stopped and camped, places that where people gave birth, places where people were buried, places where things happened, where stories happened. And all of those place names were a rich tapestry actually of story and of presence and of love. And so, yes, I think very much that place names and mapping can serve to connect you to the land, or they can serve to disconnect you. And I think of, a lot of us live in cities right now. The sun gets up every morning in the city, the sun sets every evening in the city, the moon rises, the moon goes through all of those different phases. So there's lots of ways, even though we're living in the city, to map and be connected to those processes that are regenerating the planet.
Take an online question, and then Russ, you're going to be wandering around the room a lot. We have the next question will come here, and then the next microphone question will be on the other side of the room.
To rethink your way out of colonialism and capitalistic thinking. And the question is, how do you think educational institutions could play a role in helping us think into the land and learning from land-based practices?
Well, I think that there is a lot of really great work being done by teachers and educators and professors in rethinking education, rethinking the role of land and collection and belonging and critical thinking and all of those kinds of things. So I was in Andrea's class today, and there was a lot of really amazing things happening. In my work at the Chinta, we've been able to place elder knowledge and land-based learning at the core of our program. So we've been able to advocate at UBC for 50% of the marks for all of our courses are coming from the land-based component. So I think that there's lots of really good work being done, and there's lots of things that we can do to get outside and to get connected and to get thinking critically about the kind of society we want to live in and how we want to relate to each other and how we want to relate to the planet.
Chimigwech, thank you for your words and actions. My name is Laura. I'm in my third year of studying environmental science and Indigenous environmental governance at the university. And I'd like to ask a question about restoration. I'm part of a food sovereignty and environmental restoration partnership called the Mahnomen Project. And hearing you speak about Curve Lake and the Wet'suwet'en makes me very happy, so thank you for mentioning that. And the Mahnomen Project seeks to understand and restore Mahnomen, specifically in the Winnipeg River, in a good way by braiding scientific and Indigenous knowledge. And you beautifully shared stories of harm leading to the land and water, the eels and the dams. And you beautifully braided science and Anishinaabe knowledge in your passages and in general how you go about enacting the change you do. I'd like to ask, what does restoration in a good way look like to you?
It looks like the Alderville Tallgrass Prairie, which is a restoration project that Rick Beaver has been really involved in. You can look it up online. Tallgrass Prairies and Black Oak Savannas were a part of the natural ecosystem. I know in my work I talk a lot about wild rice and a lot about sugarbush, but black oak savannas and tallgrass prairies are really important as well. And the project on the reserve at Alderville has been to restore the prairie and the black oak savanna. And I think it's a really good example of Anishinaabe knowledge and inspiration and ingenuity working alongside with Western science to restore and grow a prairie. So it's one of my favorite things to do is to go and walk and see this incredible diversity of species that even though I've spent a lot of time in the bush, you only see on the prairie or in the black oak savanna.
Anonymous question, but I think it's from a young person. They first thank you for the wonderful talk and offer an apology, saying they're sure you get this question all the time, and in many ways it may not be your task to answer. But what advice would you offer to young people who seek to connect with and learn with lands and waters, as well as with Indigenous peoples, but who are at the same time struggling with their inheritance from their white settler ancestors?
Well, thank you for coming to the lecture on Zoom, and thank you for that question. I think that it can be a struggle, and I would encourage you to take all of the opportunities that you have to connect with Indigenous people, to read our work, to immerse yourself in study, to get out on the land, to hike, to watch sunrises and sunsets and moonrises and moonsets, to look at the stars, and just also be really gentle and kind with yourself, because learning is a journey, and this kind of learning that's full body and that's emotional learning and physical learning and intellectual learning and spiritual learning is a lifelong process. And I think by coming to things like this and asking those kind of questions that you will get there.
Hello, my name is Lex Dulong. I am in my 5th year studying international development here at the university. I have a feeling your answer to this might be similar to what you just said, but in the realm of research, especially within your own community, how do you stay motivated when your research can become disheartening?
Research becomes disheartening. Writing becomes disheartening. It's very, very much part of the process. So I think that this kind of work that we're doing is struggle. And it's also a tremendous privilege to have time and to have energy and to have resources to be able to read and to think and to do talks and to conduct research. So I think taking very good care of yourself, surrounding yourself with supportive people and mentors and building that community of support is really, really important. Taking breaks, but also staying with it and recognizing that sometimes you have to plow through to get to the next step. But this work isn't easy work, and I think when you have people, when you have a supportive committee, when you have other students that are a community around you, you can sort of support each other through those times. I think, you know, every time you write, every time I go to write, I think that I can't do it. It's always hard to get that crappy first draft written. It's always hard to get that, you know, next paragraph. There's always a voice telling you that you didn't read enough, that you didn't think carefully enough, that you're a fraud, that you shouldn't be doing this work. And I think over time, you learn to shut out those voices and give yourself permission to write that crappy first draft and then go back and edit and reread. And I think research is the same way.
Thank you.
We have right there. And then we have the next, the next question will be in the middle here. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. My name is Samuel, in the international development specialization, with my main unit being public health. I'm from Africa, and I really enjoyed, the aspect of the migratory eel and how, that shows the interconnectedness really of the world, and not just ethnic people, but communities. So my question to you would be, have you had because your work is really important, have you been able to maybe share your work or maybe present elsewhere around the world? Have you, and maybe how has your work been received, and how do you see some commonalities between your work and what's been done elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, so I've just kind of post-pandemic, and my kids are now approaching adulthood. So I've been able to travel a little bit more. I've spent some time in northern Finland and Sami territory, and seeing through their land-based practices around salmon fishing and also reindeer herding. I spend a lot of time in the north in Canada. I am going to Australia in a couple of weeks. So yeah, I haven't yet been to the continent of Africa, but I think that there is a lot of connections between Indigenous peoples in Africa and Indigenous peoples in South America and North America. There's lots of differences as well, but I think it's been interesting to me to have these ideas travel, but also I think the most beautiful thing is to have other Indigenous people say, oh, that's interesting how you think about water. This is how we think about water. So that thinking alongside, so not debating who thinks about water better, but this kind of sharing of what people know from their particular area and from their particular knowledge system.
Hi, Dr. Simpson. It was an honor to hear you speak today, so thank you so much for your talk. My name is Lindsay Thompson, and I work here at the University of Guelph at the Community Engaged Scholarship Institute, and I'm also a second-year PhD student in the Social Practice and Transformational Change program. My question for you is, I'm really interested in the concept of things being emergent rather than centralized and in connection with normative practice, as you spoke about. And I just wondered if you could say more about what being emergent looks like and how you see that being connected to water and decolonizing practice. Thank you.
So I just read Andrea Ritchie's new book called Practicing New Worlds, which is about emergent strategy in organizing and activist communities, kind of building on Adrienne Maree Brown's work. So that's amazing. I think for me, it's sort of a simple practice that I learned on the land with elders, and it's just that it's sort of a practice of humility and collaboration and respect, and that when you're collaborating with trees and you're making maple sugar, there's a lot of variables, there's a lot of beings' knowledge coming together, and you shouldn't be so arrogant to think that you're going to be able to predict the outcome, that outcome emerges based on your practice, based on the emotions that you bring to the practice. And that's a part of why the gift is in the making. So you see that with high tanners in the north all the time. And high tanning is really challenging for me because I'm not good at it. But the old ladies will often say, like, don't scrape the hide when you're angry. In part because, like, if you're aggressive with it, you're going to put a lot of holes in it. But you need to be calm. You need to be grounded. You need to put good energy and good emotions into the practice of tanning hides because they're going to take that energy on. And that, to me, is an emergent process. And I see emergence as, I don't know what the alternative is to global capitalism. But I think by coming together and visioning and dreaming and taking care and respecting self-determination and consent and building consensus, I think that's how you generate the knowledge to figure out how to build worlds like my ancestors knew how to do. And that to me is very emergent. So thank you for that question.
A question from Ella Mastage from the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development here at Guelph, who first says thank you for a wonderful presentation. They really appreciated your amazing interpretation of physical properties of snow, specifically its metamorphosis from the moment it falls on the ground and how it teaches us about forming relations. Could this interpretation substantiate the coexistence of Western science and Indigenous knowledge?
Well, that's a question I would put back. Could it? I think there's, of course, potential there. I think when you have a tremendous imbalance of power, that's going to complicate that. When you have one system, Indigenous knowledge, that is dependent upon the sanctity and the health of the planet and of the environment, and that is under attack, that's going to complicate it. Things like land dispossession complicates it. So I think that there's potential, but it's also fraught. And I think that's one of the things that that we're all thinking about, I think specifically at universities, with a lot of students that I've talked to today that are in environmental science programs, figuring out how to use different knowledges and different knowledge systems together in a way that's respectful and that generates the kind of knowledge that we need going forward. So yes and no.
Hey, Chimigwech, and thank you. It's always very humbling to listen to you speak, and I'm deeply grateful for the way you weave your stories and politics and praxis together. And I want to say thanks for speaking about abolition. Feel to share. I have been very lucky to grow up with an understanding of how to stand on a shoreline and feel like being with. And as a queer and a trans person, I grew up in a really very homophobic, overtly transphobic place. And so the feeling of belonging in the natural world was incredibly important. And I can say I've noticed over the last few weeks, because I live on a creek, standing on the shore and feeling like that the space between me and all the wilds couldn't be greater. And I note that, or I think that is because I went to the 1 million march and the counter protest in Guelph and also in Toronto. And trying to witness and figure out how to engage wholeheartedly in very polarized dialogues about so many things in the world right now. And I stand on the shore and I just feel so separate. And I also, I'm trying to lean into those abolitionist ideals that have helped me in the past, like non-disposability. What does that actually look like? If I were to say everyone in this space has a spot in the circle that is sacred, how do I actually practice that? And what does it look like to have meaningful accountability, meaningful consequences for people who might yell in my face, I wish you didn't exist. And I'm sure many, many other people here have their own experiences of that in some way. And so I'd feel to ask you, because you said you've been on tour with Robin, who is flipping brilliant as you are, and you've been sitting in circles with brilliant people. So what are they leaning into right now? What's the kind of, how are you grappling with some of these ideas of abolition today when it feels like it's even harder to imagine than it was 4 years ago or even 4 days ago?
I think that yes to all of that. I'm glad that you're sitting at the shore, because I think the shore is that overlapping of the water world and the land and the air. And so I think sitting at the edge of the shore, and you know those waves coming up in that fractal formation, I think it's a very powerful, very emergent place to spend time. I just read the book by Kelly Hayes and Miriam Kaba, Let This Radicalize You. And I think that instilled, as Miriam Kaba says, a practice of hope, not the emotion of hope, but the practice I think I learn a lot from, being in bush camps. You have to get up in the morning and build the fire and chop the wood and go to the lake and get the water to make the tea. And it doesn't matter if you're depressed or uninspired. If you don't do the work of life, then you don't have tea and you don't have breakfast. So I think of my ancestors a lot and what they lived through. I think that there's a lot of kind of small scale mutual aid projects, a lot of small scale transformative justice projects. I feel like the people in disability studies are doing really amazing and important work. And so there are these pockets of people coming together and building the kinds of worlds that I want to be a part of. And so I do a lot of amplifying as much as I can with that. And hanging on to that. I think it helps me to be involved in projects where I'm doing something. It helps in times where the world seems extremely messed up for me to be like stream of consciousness writing, to figure out how to have a voice and to have to contribute, because we're in a dire situation. I think that's also what I'm hearing from you. But I think there's a lot of good that's happening as well.
Very brief online comment from a PhD student here at Guelph, Hazib Bano, and Hazib just wants to say, I'm from the Himalayan ranges of Pakistan. I'm working on the indigenous practice of glacier grafting, and your lecture has really given me another level of energy to continue my research in this area of water. So
amazing. Well, I wish all of the PhD students and master students and undergraduate students the best of luck with all of your work, and I hope that you can find some energy and also some moments of calm, because I think that's really important when you're a student as well.
Okay, I think this will probably be our final question. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. My name is Arlene. I'm in the work of water advocacy and water justice work, and I'm not exactly sure how to pose this question, but I guess increasingly I'm understanding the importance of learning how to listen to water, and in terms of trying to do that work itself, and be able to listen to her intently to try to advocate on her behalf as best we can. And, and seeing so many places around the world, and seeing it right now too, where water herself is being weaponized against communities, and trying to grapple with the ways to listen to her, to listen to the water and all the peoples who are impacted. I guess my question is something like, have you any thoughts on how to listen to water in the context of water herself not being withheld from people in many contexts, but right now particularly in Gaza is.
I think when you were talking, I was thinking about how when someone in your family is sick, you don't abandon them, you caretake. And so sometimes, right now the water is contaminated, the water is being weaponized, but you don't abandon. People are not disposable. You caretake through that. And so I don't know, but I think for me, spending that time at the shoreline every day, spending time, intentional time, where I'm trying to find things like sintering, trying to learn from the water. I think making maple sugar and maple syrup from boiling the tree water and combining that, like all of these kinds of things, I think are opportunities to to think about water in a different way. And I think as we move forward, we're only going to see water being weaponized more. I think First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous communities have a lot of experience with dealing with contaminated water and not having drinking water, as do many communities in the global South. And so, yeah, I don't know, but I do think the practice of thinking alongside and listening across cultures and geographies around water is important.
That brings us to the end of our time here today. And again, I want to thank Leanne for bringing us together to help us think about how to live in community. For me, this has been a real life-giving event in the middle of a time where a lot of people are struggling. So thank you for gifting that to us. Please join me.